Hello, and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the Dnieper front, where we see here that the Ukrainian forces managed to gain yet another foothold on the eastern bank of the Dnieper River. We see here that the Ukrainian forces currently hold two positions on the eastern bank of the Dnieper River, here to the west and here to the east of the Pittsdepne area. So we see here that the Ukrainian forces have managed to cross the Dnieper River in two areas. It seems that the Ukrainian plan is to connect the two of these by capturing coastline here in the northern parts of the section. So we see that the Ukrainian forces are now attacking here and here. We're likely to see further attacks by the Ukrainian forces to establish their position and also attempts to capture this whole area. We see, based on the area, that the Russian positions are concentrated on the southwestern parts of this area and the eastern parts, as that is where there's a lot more residential areas. In comparison, here in the center, there's hardly any. In this whole area that I've selected, there's only two, and with Pittsdepne and the southwestern parts. So we see that the Ukrainian forces are looking to fully capture Krinky and this one here, as well as Pittsdepne here to the west, allowing them to secure positions and then start deploying more forces in the area. This will force the Russian forces to relocate units from the eastern parts down here so that they're able to deal with the Ukrainian forces now crossing the Dnieper River in a larger number than we have seen so far in this war. The Ukrainian forces are now seeing much more success than they've seen so far. This is likely a result of the continuous attempts by the Ukrainian forces to advance through the Dnieper River, and as such they have now learned from all of their mistakes and they have adapted and they are now able to conduct successful operations across the Dnieper River. The question here is, how big of a scale is this and how many units are across and so on, and will they be able to hold on to these positions? They have so far been able to, as they first captured a foothold before November, and now it's the 6th of November, so they have held this foothold for over a week now, which indicates that they have a significant enough force to be able to withstand Russian counterattacks in the area. We then move on to the Robotyne area, where here the Ukrainian forces continuously launch attacks on Russian positions, where they attempt to expand their zone of control by Robotyne, as the front line is very close to the village, which endangers the Ukrainian positions in the area. So they're looking to capture more of the Russian trenches here in the area, which will allow them to safeguard their positions by Robotyne. As for the Priyotny direction, we see the Ukrainian forces manage to advance here south of Levatne in the direction of Stepove, so there's still some movement here, although hardly any. This is a return to the positional war that Zelensky talked about in his interview with The Time. Moving on, we move to the Avdiivka front, where we see that the fighting continues heavily all across the front line. However, there's been no advancements since the 2nd of November, which is now 4 days ago. This means that it has largely hit a stalemate and the Russians have been unable to advance since then. This is likely as a result of the Ukrainian reinforcements arriving, allowing them to withstand the Russian attacks, and the Russians don't seem to have any overwhelming advantage when it comes to the manpower in this direction. So this raises the question, if they aren't sending their reinforcements to the Dnieper River and they aren't sending their reinforcements to Avdiivka, where exactly are the Russian forces? The reasonable response to this is that the Russian forces have three different types of units. They have their professional army, which had essentially been fighting since the very start of the war until this point. However, after a few months into the Ukrainian offensive, these professional soldiers were for the first time in almost 2 years allowed to out on rotation, on break. And that is what essentially all of them took. And in return, we have the second part, which is the mobilized forces, which had created the brunt of the Russian army since October of last year. And then the third part, which is the volunteers, which is comparable to the mobilized forces. However, these tend to be less experienced and worse equipped than the mobilized forces, because the mobilized forces have been fighting for now over a year, which has given them a year of income for which they buy their own equipment and a year of experience. In the meantime, the volunteers have largely entered the war this year. As such, they have less experience and have had less income and less opportunities to buy further equipment, and as such, they are less experienced and worse equipped than the Russian mobilized forces. Of course, the professional army is the best trained, best equipped, and most experienced part of the army, similar to the Wagner fighters. However, they have even more experience. The issue here is that they are on rotation, and as such, the Russian army has significantly weakened in comparison. Of course, it's not every single one of them at the same time, but it's actually a large amount of them, and mostly the ones who have had zero breaks. So these are the forces fighting by Bakhmut, the forces fighting by Donetsk, and the forces fighting by Zaporizhia. So while the Ukrainian forces redirect their 47th Mechanized Brigade from Zaporizhia to Avdiivka to hold the line, the Russian forces, instead of rotating it to Avdiivka, rotated them home so that they are able to rest and prepare for the next stage of fighting. So we're seeing that the Russian forces are essentially pressuring the experienced and well-equipped Ukrainian forces with fresh boots. That is to grind down the effectiveness of the Ukrainian military, as well as rely heavily on the Russian artillery to just bombard these positions and draw out the fighting in the quote-unquote new meat grinder, which is Avdiivka, to try and grind down the Ukrainian forces while their own forces get a much needed rest. Well, this of course does not negate the fact that the Russians have lost a lot of armored vehicles, but most of them seem to be damaged, which would mean that they're able to be recovered. But if the Ukrainian forces manage to launch a successful counterattack, they would be able to take these vehicles from the Russian forces, similar to the direction of Uledar last winter. If they are able to counterattack and recapture the areas here by Krasnoarivka, they would essentially gain a couple tens of armored vehicles and tanks, which would allow them to build up a whole new brigade of their own. So the Russian forces have to hold their currently held positions, otherwise they would not just have lost men and equipment for no reason, they would also have enabled an additional Ukrainian mechanized brigade. So there's many aspects to cover when it comes to this battle, as it is very significant since the Ukrainian forces have relocated their elites from the southern front to this part of the front line, while the Russian forces are using their own Stormset, Wagner and DPR units to fight this battle, while their own elite forces are in their home country resting. It seems that the Ukrainian efforts to dismantle the logistics of the Russian forces are also playing a heavy part in the lack of reinforcements to the Avdiivka direction, because we see that the Russian forces have a significant amount of troops here in the northern parts by the Luhansk-Kharkiv border, yet they are not able to send further reinforcements to the Donetsk front. This is likely due to the fact that the Russian supplies in the area most likely do not suffice sending additional reinforcements to the area, so they only have enough for the units they actually have there at the moment. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian forces also have supply issues. However, that is negated by the fact that they are on the defending side, which means that most of the supplies they actually need are already there. That means that the Russians have to go through minefields, which you don't need to resupply really. They have to pressure the Ukrainian artillery, which is allowed to be further back due to the fact that the Russians are attacking, and so on, making them more defensible. So the Russians have the disadvantage because they are on the attacking side when it comes to logistics. We then move on to the Bakhmut direction, where we here see the Ukrainian forces were pushed further back from Berhivka as the Russian forces launched yet another counterattack in the direction, trying to advance further towards Avdiivka. And we're seeing that the Russian forces are here launching some positional battles. The target seems to be to advance further from the river line and push the Ukrainians back out of Khomove. Most likely the Ukrainian positions in Khomove are threatening an infiltration towards Bakhmut due to the nature of the city being a residential one where there's a lot of ruins, which would mean that if Ukrainian forces crossed over and entered the city, it would be difficult for the Russian forces to attack them, especially if they move through the cover of the night. And they could set up position within Bakhmut and maybe even use it to go on to the back lines of the Russian forces and conduct sabotage operations. So the Russian forces are looking to cut the Ukrainians away from Khomove, allowing them to hold a better positions here by Bakhmut and allow them to protect their flanks. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.